Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to this seminar organized by the Interdisciplinary Cluster on Transnational Democracy in the 21st Century. My name is Filip Kostelka. I'm professor in the SBS department, and I'm a co-convener of the cluster with Professor Kalypso Nikolaidis from the Transnational School of Governance. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Jan Rovny, Associate Professor in the Center of European Studies and Comparative Politics at Sciences Po Paris. Jan is an expert on party politics, voting behavior, and ethnic politics. He serves as an associate editor of the journal East European Politics and Societies, and he is one of the leading, or he's one of the principal investigators of the Triple Hill Expert Survey, which is the longest running survey on political parties. His research has been published in leading journals such as the American Political Science Review, the British Journal of Political Science, Comparative Political Studies, and World Politics, among others. And today he will deliver a talk entitled Circumstantial Liberals, Ethnic Minorities, Political Competition, and Democracy. So Jan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Philip. Thank you for having me here. It's a thunderous welcome. It's wonderful to be able to talk about this project, which started a long time ago. I dare not even say how long ago. But it's a project that was inspired by some thoughts that I had about how politics is structured in Central and Eastern Europe. And when I was thinking about it, I realized that there were particular associations between different poles of political competition and the size of ethnic minorities and ethnicity that mattered. And that made me thinking, and I started sort of exploring how the presence of ethnic minorities could influence politics. And after probably almost a decade of thinking about this and doing some research, visiting some of these places, talking to individuals, talking to politicians, doing some archival work and a lot of statistical analyses, I have a sense that we have an understanding of ethnic politics that is often influenced by places where ethnicity is very polarizing, where ethnicity is often highly salient and often very conflictual. And we know a little bit less about what happens in terms of ethnicity just informing quote unquote normal democratic politics. So the aim of the project is to sort of pause and ask ourselves, what happens when ethnic minorities engage in politics, when ethnic minorities mobilize as such, and how do they influence politics in their societies? How do they influence the majorities in their societies, and what happens? And I'm hoping to have a conditional but potentially positive, normatively positive news. That is to say that ethnicity is not necessarily always a bad force in politics. The aim of the project is to identify conditions, circumstances under which ethnic minorities can actually behave as liberals. And when I say liberals, I mean lowercase liberals, and I will explain this a little bit more in the talk. So hence the title Circumstantial Liberals, with this little hopeful idea that if the conditions are right, and it actually turns out that in many circumstances they are right, ethnicity can be a force for what we would normatively consider as a good thing, democracy. I need to click on this, and let's hope that does it. Yes. So ethnic politics is commonly viewed as politics of tension, as politics that require some kind of an institutional adjustment. There are lots of books, perhaps starting with Leibhardt, about how we need institutions to kind of calm down, put a lid on ethnicity, because ethnicity is likely to lead us down a path of particularism and towards conflict, potentially even civil war. Furthermore, for the interest of comparative politics students like myself, for those who are interested in political competition, ethnic politics is generally described as antithetical to universal ideological politics. Ethnicity is about my people as opposed to other people. It is not about broader principles. It is just about me for myself, or my group for itself. It is not about any influence of ideological views. And I take issue with that. So the argument that I'd like to present to you here, and I will present kind of the broader argument of the book, and then I will demonstrate only some small aspects of it from a survey that I carried out in Slovakia and Estonia. I would like to argue that ethnic politics is circumstantial, and that under specific conditions, ethnic minorities will actually seek liberal, multi-ethnic arrangements, which will support liberal democracy. And in this sense, the presence of ethnicity, just the fact that a significant number of people, a certain share of the population, are distinct by virtue of some ethnic markers, can infuse politics with liberal policy aims. And through this, ethnicity informs ideological political competition. It can actually shape party systems. It can determine which political pole will be more liberal and which one will be less liberal. And finally, it can shape systemic outcomes. I will not talk about this here, but I do have a paper that has recently come out that demonstrates that in societies with mobilized ethnic minorities, democratic backsliding is less likely than in those without such minorities. So when I say liberals, what do I actually mean? Up here it says constitutional liberalism. I'm particularly interested in this one dimension of liberalism, and I would say that there are probably three broad ones, right? There is economic liberalism, which has to do with how the government engages with economics. Does it constrain markets? How much does it constrain markets? There is cultural or social liberalism, which has a lot to do with the liberty of the individual to live his or her life the way they want. It has to do with gender rights and so on and so forth. And then there's the third dimension, which is certainly conceptually and sometimes even empirically separate. And that is constitutional liberalism. That is the extent to which you subscribe to the basic principles of liberal democracy. And what are these basic principles? I take this straight from most of the constitutions and bills of rights of Western countries. This is, I particularly like the Canadian Constitution. The Bill of Rights of the Canadian Constitution has a wonderful list of basic individual rights and freedoms, such as civil liberties, political rights, legal rights, and equality rights. This is what I will argue that mobilized ethnic minorities will generally support. There's a big debate in political theory on whether liberalism should also include group rights, whether group rights are a part of liberal thought or whether they are antithetical to liberal thought. I do have a personal preference. I do have a position that probably sides with a group of Canadian theorists around Charles Taylor and Will Kymlicka that would argue that group rights are actually a part of liberal rights, but it is not something that's necessary for my argument. I want to suggest that, of course, ethnic minorities are also interested in group rights, but it is not just group rights that they want. They also want individual rights. So the group rights that ethnic minorities generally want are, in situations such as those that I study, it's often the tongue, the language that is spoken that distinguishes. That's sort of the visual boundary of ethnicity in the places that I study. So if language is the boundary, then ethnic minorities obviously want access to education for their children in their mother tongue. So education in places where there are sufficient numbers. The old law of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy was 20%. That law was carried forward into many of the constitutional orders of the countries that have inherited that system after its collapse after the First World War. So where there's 20% of a group that speaks a particular language, they should be provided with schooling for their children. They should also be provided with the ability to use that language in official matters. If I go to the post office or if I go to the local city hall for some kind of a basic thing like a birth certificate or a marriage certificate, etc., I should be able to do it in my language. And then, of course, support for cultural life. We want to have some kind of a support from the state, the way the state supports majority culture. We would like to have that support for the minorities as well, right? So the idea argued by Kymlicka and other authors in this tradition is that group rights are important to balance the fact that states are never neutral. The state is always dominated literally. By the majority, the state always tends to put forth the language of the majority, and in that way, it somehow diminishes the rights of these minority groups. So this is what I mean by liberalism when I talk about it. What is the argument? I call the argument ethnic liberalism. How does it work? The basic idea is that when an ethnic group that's somehow distinct, that's aware of its distinction and is recognized as distinct by the majority, when this ethnic minority group is permanently stuck within a society out of which it cannot easily leave, so it cannot join an ethnic kin state or it cannot create its own state, it becomes a permanent minority. And its minority position is dual. On the one hand, it is somehow socially distinct because it speaks a different language or because it practices a different religion or has some different cultural habits. So it's socially distinct. This distinction usually leads it to have specific political preferences. I want education in my mother tongue. I want the ability to practice my religion, to hold my religious holidays, and so on and so forth. But simultaneously, that minority is also a political minority. It can be easily overvoted in a parliamentary democratic process, given that its interests will be systematically different, at least in these areas, to those of a majority. So in this sense, because of their dual minority predicament, ethnic minorities are always more concerned about the tyranny of the majority than an average citizen. That's sort of the principal tenet of the argument. And given this fear of the tyranny of the majority, they wish to constrain majorities. And so they will be interested, more so than others, in counter-majoritarian arrangements that will limit majority rule. And so permanent ethnic minorities seek various liberal political aims, individual and group rights, as those that I've mentioned, inclusive conceptions of citizenship, the idea that being a citizen of a country isn't an ethnic concept, but it's a concept that encompasses all the people who live on the territory, despite their different ethnicities. It's more open to pluralism and civil liberties because it fears the potential repressive capacity of the majority-dominated state. When ethnic minorities mobilize, by which I understand if they're able to organize into political parties, if they have sufficient numbers to support these parties to the point where they can enter parliaments and become actors in the political process, they become potential partners. They become potential partners for someone who's willing to work with them. And the someone who's willing to work with them is usually someone who is willing to be more open to pluralism, multiculturalism, and various individual and group rights. And so as a result of this mobilization and their ability to produce groups in parliament, political representation in parliament, it strengthens the liberal pole of politics, which I demonstrate throughout the book. What is interesting is that, of course, ethnicity polarizes. My friend and colleague Lenka Buštíková wrote a fantastic book some years ago, which talks about the reaction of the radical right to the increasing rights of minorities. Right? The fact that there are minorities who are given rights leads to a reaction, an oppositional reaction on the part of the radical right. But that is the glass half empty. I completely agree with Lenka. I think she's absolutely right, and the book is great. But there is the glass half full. For every radical right person who does not like minorities, there's possibly going to be someone, even among the majority, who's going to say, you know what, rights are actually important. I care about that. I'm going to vote for these other political forces, which I would call lower L liberals, and support them. And so this creates polarization. It's something that actually we've discussed this afternoon together, right? That polarization is not always a bad thing. We think of polarization as a bad thing. Well, that's when it's extreme. But it is potentially a good thing when there's the other side that says, hey, you know, rights, liberties, democracy, that actually matters. And so in this way, the presence of ethnicity can actually influence even the majorities, create cooperation between lower L liberal ethnic actors and lower L liberal majority actors, and provide these poles that can strengthen democracy. Right, here is the structure of the book, and I'm going to see if I can remove this bar because there we go. So you probably can't read it, but let me just give you a broad sense of what the book does and how it does it. So if one is an ethnic minority, the first argument that I have is that this produces at least some latent sense of threat. The threat that you might somehow be outvoted, might not be able to somehow live out your ethnic distinction, whatever it is. You have two options. You can try to integrate. Integration into the majority society is a decision that is an individual level decision. It is done by individuals or potentially families. It is rarely, I'm not aware if ever, done by groups, right? So what happens to groups? Well, groups will seek group preservation. And now, how can you seek group preservation? That will depend. Of course, ideally, you would like to have your own self-government. You'd like to have your own state. There is a certain probability with which that can be done, right? So there is a high probability that you can have some form of self-government, either through secession, irredentism, or devolution. If the probability of that is high, you're a provisional minority, and you will be seeking asymmetric rights or outright leaving the polity and ending your minority status. If that probability is low, which is the situation in most cases today in Europe and other places in the world as well, you are a permanent minority. You are stuck. You have to live in a society where the majority speaks a different language. Yes, I'm sorry. I need to be close to the microphone. If you are a permanent minority, this is when the potential for ethnic liberalism kicks in. But this potential is cross-pressure. So you might be seeking liberal rights, but whether that happens will be conditioned. And so here are the circumstantial effects. It will be conditioned by the group political significance. The bigger the group is, there's probably a curvilinear relationship, but in my cases, I don't really have very big groups. The biggest group I have is in Estonia, which is roughly 35%. So the bigger the group is, the more important it is, the more potentially threatening it is, and the more responsible it is. That's interesting. Smaller groups have the freedom to be irresponsible. So group political significance strengthens the search for ethnic liberalism. Ability to work with others. If you can find other forces from the majority or from potentially other minorities who are willing to work with you on some other issues, economic issues, social issues, that is going to strengthen your search for ethnic liberalism. Group secular identity. You won't be surprised that where ethnicity is defined by religious identification, ethnic liberalism is weakened because religiosity is specific and particular and often conservatizing. So I have a number of description and cases where the effect, this liberal effect attenuates with the strength of religiosity. It only attenuates to zero. It never goes to a negative effect. And finally, kin-state influence. Kin-state influence runs both ways. There are situations when kin states implore their minorities to cooperate, to not be difficult. This was the case of Weimar Germany, which turned towards Czechoslovakia and Poland and said, please work with their governments. Please be responsible. It can also work the other way. Think of Russia, think of Hungary, where they're saying, you're not really minorities in your state of residence. You are a part of a bigger nation. They tear them out of their minority status. They effectively end the effect of ethnic liberalism because these people no longer see themselves as being represented within their state of residence, but rather through the big leader in the ethnic kin state. This has systematic consequences. It creates polarization over rights and civil liberties, which creates and strengthens a liberal pole, a pole that will be opposed by the radical right or nationalist or conservative, but it exists, it is defined, and it is understood. And that structures party systems. It then leads to the way that political systems deal with new issues. So in the book, I discuss European integration and immigration. And then finally, it also leads to the support for democracy. So now I'm probably running a little low on time, but I'd like to just jump into a part of the study where I have done my original survey in Slovakia and Estonia. I want to only talk about Slovakia, not because it has better results. The results are actually really the same, but it's a little more interesting because I was able to have much higher quality sampling. It was done in person with 95% of the Hungarians. So I actually had people going into the south of Slovakia, talking to Hungarian grandmas and showing them my survey experiment. I also was able to get 1,037 Hungarian respondents, so self-identified Hungarian in Slovakia, and a comparative representative sample of ethnic Slovaks. I asked them a little bit about their preferences, just to sort of check how they would like to see their state organized. And I created a sort of a factor out of a number of items where you can see that in terms of multiculturalism, the Hungarian minority, despite their potential social conservatism, was significantly greater than the Slovak majority. If we look at state arrangements, so how should the Slovak state be arranged? Should it be a Slovak nation state, which is effectively the status quo? The Slovak constitution starts by saying, we the Slovak people. You can see that a tiny, tiny minority of the Hungarians like the status quo in that symbolic sense. The other option I gave them was, would you like to have a Slovak nation state that is shared with the minorities? That was acceptable to a relatively large part. But the third option was, would you like a multi-ethnic state where, you know, whoever lives in the country is equally a founding person, founding people of the state? And that was by far preferred by the majority of the Hungarian minority group. Similarly, cultural arrangements. I effectively asked them whether there basically should be only Slovak culture allowed in public, whether there should be segregated existence of Slovak culture and Hungarian culture carried out in private, or whether the cultures should mix in the public space. And you can again see that while the Slovaks are actually relatively split across the three, the Hungarian minority is overwhelmingly in favor of public presence of Hungarian. This is less striking in a place like Slovakia. The results are basically the same in Estonia, where if you know about Estonia, speaking Russian in Estonia is a statement. People, of course, do it because there are many Russian speakers who live in particularly the bigger cities. You know, having a public place for Russian language in Estonia is a highly, highly political and sensitive question. The Estonian Song Festival, the mayor of Tallinn, a Russian speaker actually of Kazakh origin, suggested that there be one Russian song at the Estonian Song Festival. And it caused a huge storm, and it was absolutely politically unacceptable for an overwhelming part of the majority. Ideology and politics. Here I'm predicting propensity to vote for different political parties as a function of ideology, so a liberal conservative scale, while controlling for a slew of socio-demographic characteristics. What you can see here, this party here, Most Híd, is a multi-ethnic, or was a multi-ethnic party that was really a very nice expression of my ethnic liberalism. It was a very open-minded, truly a liberal party that sought to speak to both Hungarians and Slovaks in Slovakia. What is very interesting is to see that, you know, Slovaks are generally very unlikely to vote for it, but Hungarians are equally likely to vote for it, no matter their ideology. What I want to say here is that the presence of this quite explicitly liberal, socially liberal party that spoke openly about women's rights and gay rights and even immigration, which is quite something in Central Europe, is able to capture conservative voters as well as liberals. It is in a way an ethnic magnet that liberalizes those who potentially would not be very liberal. I will, for the sake of time, just jump to this one. This political party is proto-fascist. It's a very typical radical right, maybe not typical, it's probably a little deeper than typical radical right party. Its leader was seen in wartime proto-Nazi uniforms. What you can see here is what I would call the ethnic gap. So even among conservatives, conservative Hungarians are quite unlikely to vote for this party, which is understandable. Who would vote for Slovak Fascist Party if they are a minority, right? Doesn't make a lot of sense, even though the party is not explicitly anti-Hungarian. It is here. It shows in a way how ethnic minority status protects you, so to speak, right? Dissuades you from voting for someone with whom you might share some political views if you are a deep conservative. And this is just a hypothetical vote for Viktor Orban's party in Hungary. What is interesting to see is that, of course, Hungarians who are conservative are quite likely to like him and support him, but so are Slovaks. And that goes down very significantly with ideology. And then if we look at liberals, both Hungarians and Slovaks do not like him and would not support his party. This leads me to the final empirical demonstration that I'd like to show you today. And that was an experiment that I've carried. And I actually like to thank Philip because I've discussed it with him. He's responsible. No, he's not. He's not responsible for any of the errors, but it was a pleasure to discuss many of the aspects with him because it took me quite a long time to think it through. I don't think it's perfect, but I think it does what I hoped it would do. So the idea is to use the fact. So I did this both among the Hungarians in Slovakia and the Russians in Estonia. I will again just show you the Slovak case, but it is really quite comparable in Estonia as well. If you told me at the beginning of the survey that you were a Hungarian, which is a direct question that is quite normally done in these countries, I put you into a random assignment. Either you got an experimental treatment, which I will call the Hungarian nation, so a majority, or experimental treatment 2, where I will tell you that you are a Hungarian minority in Slovakia. Yeah? And then there's a control group that is not told anything about ethnic groups. Slovaks were given just the control treatment because, of course, it's difficult to convince them that they're Hungarians. How did it work? So you got a vignette first. The vignette attempted to do 3 things. This is based on the work by Paul Snyderman and Samara Klar. It tried to, on the one hand, increase the salience of groupness. Secondly, suggest a sense of threat. And further, engage in a sense of efficacy through the group. So the whole point is just to let you know that you should think of yourself as a part of this group and that this group somehow matters to you, okay? And I varied what the group was in this experimental treatment to be either the Hungarian nation. So I'm telling Hungarians in Slovakia, you are a part of the Hungarian nation. It matters that you're a part of the Hungarian nation. Or alternatively, I told a randomly selected other set of people, you are the Hungarian minority in Slovakia. So priming the fact that you are a part of a big nation or you're a part of a smaller minority within another state. Yeah, so that was throughout the whole text. This is the control treatment. This is what 1/3 of the Hungarians got. It's about growing roses. It has nothing to do with ethnicity. I'm not aware of roses in any way implying any kind of ethnic belonging to being a Slovak, a Hungarian, greater Hungarian, smaller Hungarian. So hopefully that had no effect whatsoever. It was just a text of the same length to tire them out equally. And then finally came the question, but the questions were prefaced to further finalize the treatment of you are a part of a bigger Hungarian nation. So what should the ideal state for us Hungarians look like? Right? And then there were a set of statements about basic democratic principles, such as having strong leaders who don't care about rules, such as independent judges, support for minorities, interests of the common people, equal rights, strong police, independent public media, and strict judges not afraid to give hard sentences. Yeah. And so you were either told that you should be, if you were treated that you are a part of this bigger Hungarian nation, you should be assessing an ideal state, which is your majority state. If you were told that you're a Hungarian minority in Slovakia, you were asked to assess the ideal Slovak state. And the control group didn't get any ethnic connection, so it was just the ideal state. Okay. And here are, to me, the most interesting results. This is the result for the first question, whether we should have a strong leader, and the higher you score, the more you oppose having a strong leader. And you can see that the minority significantly, these differences are statistically significant, significantly opposes having a strong leader than those people who were in the majority treatment. I further ran this model just checking for what you think about Viktor Orban, who is a strong leader. And it slightly influences the estimates, but really in no noticeable way. If we look across all the questions that I asked, most things worked in the right direction. Actually, almost all things worked in the right direction. Some of them were not significant. So probably the questions weren't properly posed, or I don't know, but you can see that this one is significantly different in the correct direction. So minorities oppose that general interest be sort of the basis for deciding things, right? Of course, general interest is the majority interest. Similarly, they're opposed to the idea of general will, which is known to be kind of a part of this populist view of politics. The general will is not going to be their minority will. And then finally, they are opposed to strong police. Minorities are significantly opposed to the strong police because guess who the strong police usually is and whose orders it works on. The others were not statistically significant. I don't know why. Perhaps I asked them wrong. So allow me to conclude with a little bit of a delay. So in this book, I try to argue that ethnic minorities can be circumstantial liberals, that under a set of conditions, they will seek civil rights and civil liberties, and that this is based in their individual interest, in their individual sense of threat that leads them to somehow try to constrain majorities. And that we can see through this experiment directly that there is an effect of whether you think of yourself as a majority placed in a state which is controlled by your people, as opposed to being a minority in a state that's controlled by someone who is somehow distinct from you and from whom you differ on some salient characteristic. What is interesting is that even when individual minority members hold socially conservative values, they tend to support parties that seek liberal and multi-ethnic goals. So these parties are able to in some way trump potentially problematic political preferences. And of course, in the context of talking about Slovakia, and I didn't have a chance to talk about this, but we can do it in the Q&A, the role of the kin state is important. I can trace the decline of Hungarian politics over the course of roughly the last 15 years and how Orban has been able to capture one of the political parties and really make it, in the section of that chapter is called Orban's Orbit, how it was able to kind of bring it into its orbit and completely undermine its historically very pro-democratic credentials. On a more pessimistic note, we have to be very careful about these kin states that literally rip the minorities out of their minority status by symbolically and sometimes economically and politically linking them with the greater nation. Thank you very much. I look forward to all comments and questions.
Thank you, Jan, for this fantastic talk. So we can open the floor to questions from the audience. Are there any questions? Ellen, please.
This is a very bad question because it really is going in a different direction, but I'm still curious about it since you mentioned you are very interested in Charles Taylor and Wilhelm Lecker. Now, can a group have rights? To me, rights is an individual thing. We're protecting the rights of the individual. And the rights you mentioned, like language rights, that could be conceived of as an individual right, not necessarily a group right. So, whereas child marriage is conceived as a group right, which is why I don't like group rights, because it's an extreme example, but it's hard to conceive. It's really the right of the child to be married off to somebody else. So I just was wondering, is it necessary to call these group rights? Can that be a useful distinction? Does it fit more with, you know, this liberal constitutional order? But as I said, it's a bad question because it's not really touching your results or anything like that.
Thank you. I mean, the whole discussion of group rights plays a very small role in the whole book. I wanted to engage it because I find it an interesting discussion. I don't know how Kimlicka or Taylor or Patton would respond to you right now. I find it very compelling the way they argue their case. They basically say the state is not neutral and therefore groups should have certain rights. Secondly, individuals need group culture to make sense of their individual liberties, right? So we are actually unable to know what we want without our culture, which is a group thing. Those are the two arguments for why group rights should exist. In his 95 book, Kimlicka has a list of things that also must be true of the group, and one of them is non-oppression of their members, right? So allowing the members to leave if they want to, and not limiting their individual rights as well. So, you know, I'm willing to personally subscribe to this, but I want to point out that the argument doesn't need it. So I agree with you. The argument doesn't need it because we could actually treat this as individual rights. I frankly don't know how many times the word group rights appears in the manuscript. I will check and I hope it's not too many. Thanks.
Short thing. Philip von Paris is here, and I don't know if you're here tomorrow, but he has a book on language rights, which I unfortunately haven't read, but if you have the time, he might be a very interesting person to chat with. I don't know if you're flying out very early or something, but
well, there is a strike, so I may not fly at all.
Okay. So anyway, I highly recommend speaking to him. He's very interesting.
Great, thank you.
Yes, there is one concept, it's more sociological, I admit, which I'm quite surprised not to have heard you use. And that's the concept of cross-cutting cleavages. That is the classic arguments, mainly in the literature on pluralism, is that that's what's important for ethnic minorities, is that ethnic minorities do not at the same time have distinctive professions, live in the same place, etc. So when you have cleavages like that and your neighbors are likely, and you know what it means, you use the concept pluralism at some point, but I didn't know what you meant by that. And I'm surprised because it seems to me that if you asked an ordinary political sociologist, what is the most important characteristic of minorities? It is that some minorities are really minorities. That is to say, they have cumulative cleavages and don't share all sorts of experiences, occupational, residential, blah, 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 with others. It's only when they're cutting across each other that you get the more desirable outcome. Now, how did that argument, or does it figure at all in your thinking?
Great, thank you. It absolutely does. So part of this book has come out of discussions I've had with Herbert Kitchell, and he would say it's the economy, right? And I've thought a lot about this. If I think of I probably should have said this earlier. I mean, the book is applied to 11 Central and Eastern European countries. That's the kind of scope. I have done some vignettes to look at very distinct, different other places. But in those 11 countries and the minorities that I study, they're very different. Some of them are historically better off than the majorities. Some of them are historically very much worse off than the majority. So a number of these.
I want to like what you wall opposite. Please use the microphone.
He had maps with ethnic or religious distributions and over a period of, I don't know, 30 years or something like that. And what you discovered was Catholics started living closer to Protestants. And so you start out with the map, and here is, you know, a southern part of the Netherlands, which is solidly Catholic, and all these, even two different kinds of Protestants. And that became the explanation, or key explanation, for the entzuiling business, and therefore, right?
So
absolutely. But you don't have residence, you don't have occupation, and
I do not measure
trade union membership, and blah 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 blah.
I do not measure this directly. What I do look at is individual income and group income difference from the majority. Right. So what you are describing, what you are describing is a situation that the situation in my 11 cases is one of very different positions of cohabitation, segregation.
Exactly.
you know, very strong sorting in terms of lower social strata, higher social strata, and so on and so forth.
Well, but especially living, I was thinking in the Estonian case, isn't it?
These-
The Russians tend to live all together, so to speak, a bit physical
Yes.
segregation.
So there is Estonia and there is Latvia. In Estonia, in Tallinn, there is the suburb of Lasnamäe, which is the Russian suburb. In Riga, there is no such thing. They live all together. And both cities are 50-50, right? So I have exactly the same cases. What I argue in the book is that it does not make a difference for ethnic liberalism. So it does make a difference for whether they will co-marry, whether they will sort of be more open to each other, right? Whether they will sort of tolerate each other more. I think it's very important for tolerance. So to be fair, all of my societies are at a place where these ethnic distinctions are not ones that one would fight over. However, in places like Estonia, I mean, I've been witness to some discussions of Russians that were very, very angry and Estonians that were very, very angry. And I was very, very uncomfortable because I was in an obscure building in the port of Tallinn, right? So my point is that no matter where they stand and whether, so specifically responding to Herbert, whether the economic cleavage is cross-cutting or overlapping, the behavior of ethnic liberalism is the same.
Thank you. Okay, first I have a clarification question and then a question on the experiment. So going back to the graph that you showed us before, the one with the theoretical framework, you said that different minorities are assigned different probabilities in terms of remaining forever permanent minorities, right? And I wanted to ask whether how is this probability defined or estimated? Is it endogenous to minorities' characteristics, or is it the outcome of external factors? And then I can ask you about the experiment.
The answer to this is so that's a theory, right? That was a theoretical framework that I put up. In the model, I don't have a single model that would be that. I have many different models that illuminate different components of that theory. The particular effect of conditionality of separation, I study through a case study, and that case study are the Sudeten Germans in Czechoslovakia. And they're, to me, a very fascinating one because it's literally close to home. And secondly, because that minority over the course of the roughly 20 years in which they were in a minority position went from being, you know, very unlikely to be a minority. They thought of themselves as Austrians, and suddenly a bunch of Czechs created a new country. What does that mean, right? So the first couple of years, these minorities didn't think of themselves as Czech, didn't even think what Czechoslovakia, what the heck is that? That doesn't exist. There is no such thing as Czechoslovak, right? And then as the probability of Czechoslovakia existing and sustaining itself became very clear, certain group of them started to collaborate very, very actively and very democratically with the Czech majority. All of that came to the end not with the Great Depression, but only with the rise of Hitler and his turning towards extraterritorial minorities around 1934, 1935. Yeah, so the key thing is it was not in 31 or 32, it was in 34 and 35. I do actually demonstrate this through text analysis of their speeches, that they have changed their tone over the course of these 20 years. So I do not assign probabilities, I study it through a case study.
This is my second question. I mean, maybe it's just me, but I'm not really following the logic of the experiment in the sense that, so you first asked all of the participants to choose what they identify with. So in a way, everyone is kind of primed, no? Or is that just a normal?
Oh, so in these countries, it's a basic question. It's like in the United States, if someone tells you whether you're Black or Caucasian, right? It's something that they're always asked wherever they go in an official document. They're asked, are you Hungarian? Are you Slovak? What are you? It's normal for them, right? It's very abnormal in France, but it's very normal there. So they just tick a box. They're asked, are you a man or a woman? Are you, what is your age? What is your ethnicity? I do offer other, absolutely.
First of all, thank you for your presentation. Very interesting. Well, my question might be like a bit aside, but I wonder if ethnicity is somehow reflected in political, electoral corruption and clientelism. You know, because actually, like we know, it's common knowledge that parties takes an advantage of ethnicity, ethnic groups, territorial concentration and mutual social control between ethnic people. And this advantage allows political parties to actually mobilize people and distribute some goods, particular goods. And I think it's not precisely about liberalism, but it's about the choice between particularistic and versus like programmatic attitudes, right? So I'm just wondering about that.
Fantastic question. That's a great question. It's a question that I've been asked a few times, and my response to that is this: pork does not preclude principle, right? So the point is, absolutely, they want pork. They want pork. They want for themselves, and they often get it precisely because of what you said. They have territorial control. In Slovakia, very often when they were in government, they controlled the Ministry of Agriculture. The Ministry of Agriculture deals with agricultural land, subsidies, jackpot, right? Now, are they more corrupt than other Slovak parties? Difficult to measure. My hunch is probably not, right? It's easier for them because they have a much more delimited clientele. The clientele is clear. How do you speak when you wake up in the morning and see your kid, right? So yes, there is pork, but pork does not preclude principle. They're happy to give to theirs and have support from theirs, but that does not mean that when push comes to shove and there is a vote on a law, that they will not actually start thinking, you know, do we constrain majority rule or do we give more leeway to majority rule? And even though they're happy to have their pockets full, they will constrain majority rule. So thanks.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, first, I think it's really great to engage both in the empirics and theory in such a way, like in something that is not so usually done. I think it's very good to try at least to make this kind of relationship and also to study countries like Slovakia, of course, that are not so much studied. But so yes, maybe from the theory side, I have just maybe one kind of common idea is that I think that what's interesting in the history of liberalism itself is that, like, since the early liberalism, like John Locke, we have this kind of idea, because before he was writing the treatise on separation of powers, he was actually writing on the religious tolerance. So I think it's something that was present, I think, in certain current of liberalism in its inception, like the idea that the more heterogeneous a society is and the more tolerance of diversity is, the better it creates the condition for let's say for at least separation of powers. So maybe this is my kind of question. Yeah, what about the link to religious minorities you see in this direction, or in compared to maybe national minorities, ethnic minorities, and then maybe okay. And just one about the distable, I think there was just, you used the term integration in the first step outside, and I was maybe confused whether it's really integration or more assimilation, because integration, it would mean like preserve probably a certain identity, but in this case, like really getting rid of all links to the nation and just becoming part of the nation, majority nation. So, and maybe also to this graph, is there kind of a way back to the secessionism, like at some point, like in the end, when there is a new opportunity coming, that it's kind of a big, like a new occasion that can arise, and so it doesn't finish, and that's the point.
Thank you. So concerning religious minorities, I identify kind of the key groups that are able to sustain political mobilization, which in some of my cases, such as Croatia, is actually more clearly, it's difficult to define it by language, because what's the difference between Croatian and Serbian? I hope there are no. The difference is that you know, one's grandfather went to an Orthodox church and the other one's grandfather or grandmother went to a Catholic church. That's the difference. So I actually use the religious affiliation to identify these cases in some of my surveys where I don't have better questions. I actually consider ethnic minorities to be defined by all sorts of boundaries, whether they be religious, phenotypical, right? So I would think that it doesn't, language is of course the one that tends to be most salient in the cases that I study, but it doesn't have to be. There's a fantastic paper by a scholar named Brown, and I forget his first name. It was published in the APSR, and it's on the Netherlands, and it shows that there was greater support of Jews hiding. More people hid Jews from the Holocaust, or those who hid Jews. Let me put it this way. Jews were much more likely to survive if they lived closer to a minority church, because the minorities provided the networks that were able to hide them and help them survive throughout the war. And so it didn't matter whether they were Protestant or Catholic, it mattered that they were minority in the area in which they were. So that suggests to me that the mechanism works as well. Secession, I mean, integration or assimilation. The literature tends to talk about integration, right? Integration ends with assimilation. That's how I would understand it in terms of concepts, but that's what I meant, right? If you don't like being a minority, and that's of course something that a lot of migrant minorities do, well, assimilate, learn the language, take on the customs. It's also happening actually in Slovakia to a large degree. The process there has been so successful that I also did some focus groups. I had people in the focus groups who said to me, yeah, I'm Hungarian, but I don't really speak it. My dad was Hungarian. That's why I signed up for this. So that process is natural. It's very concerning to Orban. I've interviewed some people working for the Hungarian government, making sure that there is a lot of Hungarian funding for kindergartens, because they want to make sure that the language is caught early, because that's when they will, speak that Hungarian when they come to the focus group. Secession is a difficult thing because secession goes against the structure of the international order. I mean, look at secession in the Catalan case. So it's possible. There is potentially interest in it. I have asked, what is interesting is that, so I have asked a question of, would you like Southern Slovakia to become a part of Hungary? And I also did the survey in Hungary. Now in Hungary, a very large part of the population said yes. I mean, Slovakia is Upper Hungary, right? So I don't have the time to show the graph, but very, very large part of Hungarians think that yes, it should. Interestingly, not a very large part of the Hungarians living in Slovakia, because they know what a mess that would be and how potentially violent that could get. So they are, the threat and the response of responsibility is there. So secession, possible, but they're very careful about how they speak about it because of what that could lead to. They were actually integrated with Czechoslovak troops in the early 1919.
Max?
Yeah, thank you very much. It touches a little bit on what's been said before, but I don't think I've heard it explicitly referred to. Is one thing I've not heard is how the actions of the majority group in reaction to these demands for more liberal rights then subsequently influence the actions of the minority. And I ask the question because I'm from Ireland, so it's the case I know best. And you have a situation where Northern Ireland became not a state, but very much a defined kind of geographic area. And you had a Catholic minority, a Protestant majority. And for the first 30 years of that, there was a very small element of the Catholic minority who were aggressively trying to reunite Ireland, but the vast majority of people accepted it. However, the majority provided no rights. So in reaction, it kind of sticks to your theory, right? The minority began to campaign for this, and there was civil rights marches into the 50s, into the 60s. And it was only then when the majority reacted to that demand for civil rights, the rights you're talking about here, that then it flipped. And the demand for liberalism turned into violence and bloodshed and basically the opposite, right? So I wonder, I don't know the context of the region enough, so I don't know if this is a potential outcome in the region you're talking about, but I just wondered if you could comment a little bit about how the reactions of the majority to these demands from the minority structure some of this stuff.
Thank you. My hunch is that Ireland very much fits this, right? And I don't know enough about this case to speak about it with clarity. But what I can tell you is this: the Irish Catholics are too small in the context of the United Kingdom, right? They are a very small group in the context of that larger state. The point is that they were less useful to some liberal force. Because how many Catholics are sitting in Westminster? Very few, right? Very, very few. The difference in my case is that there are, potentially 20 Russians sitting in the Estonian parliament of 100 members, so 20%. When you have that situation, when this is why I talked about sort of permanent ethnic minorities able to mobilize and sustain political forces. When that happens and suddenly you have 5, 6, 7% or more of these people sitting in parliament, you might ignore them, you might dislike them, but someone at some point will say, we need to pass this bill and we're not going to make it. But if they voted with us, we could probably pass that bill. And we think we can sell it to them. And maybe we'll give them something in return, right? So you're going to go to them and you're going to say, this is what happened in the Czechoslovak case in 1935-6, when the social, it was actually it was the agrarians who realized that, we would like to have land reform. Land reform is going to benefit small farmers, whether they're German or Czech. We could actually get support against the socialists and communists by working with the German farmers. And so they went, and that was the first time that they actually voted together, and it led to them eventually joining the government. So it's this, the trick is that they are useful to them somehow. In the Irish case, the Irish Catholics are too small a minority to be politically useful, right? And I don't know how that would change in the context of having devolution and having a Northern Irish parliament, right? Then that probably becomes quite different.
Yeah, but this example shows that all depends on the liberalism of the majority. So you could also say, if the minority is too big, then the majority might feel even more threatened and might close the ranks. And as far as I know, the Latvians more or less did this. I mean, all the Latvian parties form the government and exclude the Russian parties. So what does it depend upon? Whether your favorable dynamics develop, so cooperation between the liberals of the majority and the liberal-minded minority, or whether the dynamics of the majority closes the ranks because it's not liberal and excludes the minority. And then I have another question.
Describe Israel too, for that matter.
Yes. I mean, it's the Northern Ireland example, which is also striking. But there is another question I ask myself, which is a bit similar to the cross-cutting cleavages Philip already mentioned. What is very important, I think, is how the minority is organized, and that depends on how it is distributed in the country. If it is geographically concentrated, then federalism would be a solution. If it is spread all over the place, then it's pillarization. And the question is whether in the countries you studied, there is anything like federalist solutions of the problem or pillarized solutions of the problem.
Thanks. The first point, I do think that there is a curvilinear effect, right? If the minority is too big, it will become too threatening. I don't know if that's the Latvian case is very interesting, and you're very right that the majority has kind of closed ranks and kept them out of government. At the same time, they were an important bloc that was skirted in government, but they importantly, I don't know if I can say that, but I think they importantly constrained some of the things that the governments could do. in you know, by virtue of their size and of for a long time they were the biggest party in parliament. They were always excluded from government, right? But they were able to probably control all sorts of committees and speaking time and use that limited power to whatever they were able to do. Concerning the organization, so my cases are very distinct. Some of them are not at all concentrated, others are very Estonia has quite a concentrated Russian population, either in Tallinn or in the northeast of the country. In Bulgaria, the Turkish population is concentrated in the south east and northeast. And so on and so forth. Other countries much more dispersed, right? Slovakia kind of in the south, but across the country. There is in no case an attempt to do either pillarization or federalism. So interestingly, no one has really attempted to do some kind of a consociational setup, or no one has attempted a federal setup, partly because these countries are relatively small. And partly because, at least initially, when these constitutional orders were written, there was a great fear that any type of an institutional basis for these minorities could give them a possibility for secession, because in most cases there are always ethnic kin states in the near abroad. So it was never carried out. So what they've been able to do and what they have done is organize political parties and contested elections through just normally passing the electoral threshold. Almost all of the cases that have significant minorities are proportional representation. So they, you know, in most cases were able to pass the 5% threshold and work through parliament.
Any other questions in the room? Or and no questions online. So if there are no questions, I guess we can wrap it up. We can thank Jan for his talk again. And thank you for attending, and hopefully see you at next seminars of the interdisciplinary cluster and the SPS department. Have a nice evening.